Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al-Mayadeen television, coming to you from Beirut. When the Hitler forces were bombarding London and many other parts of Great Britain, when we stood alone in 1940 and 41 against the Nazi war machine, Mr. Churchill came up with the slogan, "Keep calm and carry on." And by and large, the British did keep calm, carry on, and prevail. But no people on earth have had to endure for longer the pressure to keep calm and carry on of bombs and wars, invasions and occupations as the people of Lebanon. I know because I was there. I first came to the capital of Lebanon in 1977. Almost 40 years ago. It was a brief lull in a bloody war, and many other chapters of that bloody war unfolded in the years, indeed decades since. And so everything is relative. Having been myself in the streets of Beirut when shot and shell was in the air like rainfall, I know that Beirut today is not like that. Everyone is keeping calm and carrying on. What else can they do? The streets are full, the shops are busy, the restaurants too. People, like the Lebanese, don't scare easily. And yet, this very evening, when I asked a trusty confidant, how were things today in Beirut, she answered, shaky. And there's no doubt about that. In the last few weeks, the security situation has become steadily more grave. The assassination of public figures, random car bombs which slay indiscriminately men, women, and children of all faiths and of none, and of all political persuasions too. And as someone said to me this afternoon, how can we defend ourselves against this? The cars have to move, they have to park, and when they park, they could be containing a deadly cargo which could wreak death and destruction amongst the Lebanese of all kinds. And of course, this changed security situation is intimately connected to the progress of the war just up the road from here in Syria, where tens, maybe 100,000 or more of foreign fanatics have invaded the country, and together with some Syrian allies have been fighting the government in Syria and the Syrian Arab army for 3 years. The death toll, enormous. More than 100,000 dead, more than 1 million fleeing the country as refugees. Much of the ancient heritage, the beauty of Syria has been destroyed. Relations between the different religions and sects, once calm, once convivial, once friendly, with intermarriage common, and where Christian churches and Christian places of worship had a special place of honor in the country, all of that has been gravely damaged. And it would be a very optimistic person who predicted that this carnage would not spread to Lebanon. But by and large, despite the scale of the atrocities being committed in Syria, it has not yet ignited full-scale conflict in Lebanon. And yet, as my confidant said, things are undoubtedly shaky. So we have here an audience of experts and amateurs like me, professors and students like me. I know I'm a little bit old to be a student, but I'm still learning every day. And we're going to hear from them the extent to which the Lebanese are keeping calm, are carrying on, and what the likely outcome of the current conflict will be for Lebanon. Let's take one of our experts first, a fellow television presenter, Dr. Hassan Youssef, to give us his view on where we stand now. But he'll need the microphone. Let's make sure that he can be heard. Dr. Yusuf, please.
Yunus, Hassan Yunus.
Hassan Yunus.
Okay.
Please forgive me.
Our destiny in Lebanon over the past decades is only to keep carrying on, to create new modes of survival. It's our fate, despite all the uncertainties we are passing through. Unfortunately, the spillover from what's happening in Syria is leaving its burden on us. Last July, I was participating in a conference in Geneva in which Kofi Annan was there. I asked him several questions about the current situations, about the enemy which we have from our southern borders and the neighbor which we have on our northern borders. He said that you have only to worry about what's happening on your northern borders, what's happening in Syria. And he said that the prerequisite for keeping calm and carrying on, if I want to link it to your introduction, is having the Saudis and the Iranians sitting together on the Geneva II table. Otherwise, our situation will be jeopardized more and more. Because, as you know, the different political groups in Lebanon are affiliates or have this sense of affiliation to these major players in our region. Once these two major players have a certain agreement, this will positively contribute to calming down the situation in Lebanon, which we are suffering from economically due to the million Syrians who have been displaced to Lebanon, the car bombs which we are suffering from, the unrest which we are having politically, the cabinet which is not being formed due to this disagreement between the jihadi, the fundraisers of the jihadi groups. Once there is no agreement between these major players, I guess we will not calm down, despite being our will. But it's being more than what we can tolerate. Actually, there is a war on Syria, and we are suffering from.
Thank you, Doctor. We'll come back to you, of course, later. With me too is George Allam, a respected analyst and commentator and a regular guest here on Kalima Horra. George, tell us the point of view that if Geneva II actually happens, if the opposition turn up, that the heat will go out of the situation of Lebanon. Of course, an alternative point of view is that the war, if it slows down in Syria, will simply be transplanted here in Lebanon. What's your view on that?
لا شك أن جنيف 2 هو محطة رئيسية لا يمكن تجاهلها إطلاقا إذا كانت النوايا صادقة عند الدول الكبرى بإطلاق مسار سياسي على مستوى الوضع السوري. لكن حتى الآن أرى أن جنيف 2 محاصرة ب5 شروط تعجيزية. الشرط الأول هو عدم وجود توافق دولي وتحديدا روسي أمريكي حول أي مسار يفترض أن يطلق في سوريا في ظل تنامي ظاهرة الإرهاب. وبالتالي نحن الآن نسمع دون أن نشك أصوات تقول باجتزاز الإرهاب أولا لكي يمكن معالجة الأمور فيما بعد. النقطة الثانية يعني كما تحدث عنها يوم أمس كل من وزراء خارجية روسيا والولايات المتحدة هي وقف إطلاق النار. أنا لا أرى كيف أن يكون هناك وقف إطلاق نار في جبهات سورية مفتوحة في ظل غياب قيادة موحدة، في ظل طبعا وجود منظمات كما يقال في العربي الدارج فاتحة على حسابها. هذا تحدي كبير باعتقادي، حتى الآن ليس هناك من إلمام واضح بهذه النقطة بالذات، علما بأن وقف إطلاق النار ربما قاعدة أساسية لإطلاق مسار سياسي أو لأقل لإطلاق حوار، لأن أي حوار يعني يجري في ظل جبهات مفتوحة معنى ذلك أن هذا الحوار بطبيعة الحال سيؤدي إلى الفشل. النقطة الثالثة دون أن نشك هو بطبيعة الحال الجهات الإقليمية الداعمة لما يجري في سوريا. أنا لا أريد طبعا أن أتهم أحدا، ولكن هذه النار المشتعلة في سوريا تحظى بتمويل، تحظى بأسلحة، وبالتالي أنها صراع مصالح إقليمية دولية أكثر مما هي لها أهداف داخلية. مع الأسف الهدف الرئيسي لقد ضاع في سوريا تحت زحمة المصالح المتصارعة. النقطة الرابعة والأساسية باعتقادي هو ضعف المعارضة. الآن يعني في كل الانتفاضات العالمية كنا نجد القائد البطل أو قائد الثورة أو مجلس الثورة إلى ما هنالك. نرى أن هناك رؤوسا كثيرة، بعضها الجيش السوري الحر، بعضها الائتلاف المعارض، بعضها التنظيمات الأصولية إلى ما هنالك، وبالتالي انتقل الصراع مع الأسف إلى داخل الفصائل المعارضة إذا صح التعبير أو الأطياف المعارضة، لأكون دقيقا في هذا التشبيه. النقطة الخامسة والأساسية سي جورج، أنا أرى أن كل ما يجري مع الأسف هو مخطط بالنتيجة لخدمة مصالح إسرائيل، وبالتالي ما يجري اليوم باعتقادي هو أمر خطير للغاية. نحن توصلنا إلى تفاهم سحري حول معالجة السلاح الكيماوي السوري، وهذه خدمة مجانية لإسرائيل دون أي مقابل. توصلنا إلى معالجة البرنامج النووي الإيراني وهي خدمة لإسرائيل. توصلنا بطبيعة الحال إلى ما يسمى اليوم نوع من إطار التفاهم، لا أدري إذا كان سيقر أو لا، حول معالجة القضية الفلسطينية مع إعمال نقاط ثلاث هي: أولا مصير القدس وترسيم الحدود وعودة اللاجئين أو وضع اللاجئين. كل هذه الأمور أرى أن جنيف 2 حتى إذا عقد سيكون أولا بداية لمسارات طويلة. نحن أمام جنيف 3 و4 و5 إلى ما هنالك. أخشى أن نكون أمام نوع من التقسيمات الأقاليمية المذهبية الطائفية، وإن كانت هذه الأمور تأخذ نوع من الحياء في المجاهرة فيها، ولكن هي واضحة، بدليل أن الاجتماع الكردي الذي عقد في أربيل قبل أسبوعين كان واضحا بأن أكراد سوريا يجب أن يتمثلوا في جنيف 2 بوفد مستقل عن المعارضة ويطالب بنظام تعددي. الأخطر من ذلك أن وزير خارجية تركيا، وهو يعاني طبعا، تركيا تعاني من مشكلة مع الحزب الكردستاني الديمقراطي، يقول بأن لأكراد سوريا الحق في نوع من الكيان المستقل أو الإقليم المستقل إلى ما هنالك. إذا دخلنا في هذه الحسابات فمعنى ذلك أن ما يجري في العراق اليوم طبعا من صراع بين أقليم مذهبية ومن دخول طبعا التنظيمات المتطرفة لتثبت وجودها بعد أن سيطرت طبعا داعش على الفلوجة والأنبار إلى ما هنالك. إذا أخذنا بعين الاعتبار ما يجري في سوريا وقد أصبح المسار بين قتال جيش السوري الحر وأطياف المعارضة مع التنظيمات الأصولية، أخذنا الإرباك في لبنان في ظل الفراغ السياسي، في ظل احتدام الحساسية المذهبية ما بين سنة وشيعة ومسيحيين ومسلمين أما هنالك. أنا أتساءل هل أن الشرق الأوسط الجديد، وهذا نهاية المطاف، سوف يفتت إلى دويلات مذهبية طائفية تخدم مشروع إسرائيل، علما بأن إسرائيل في آخر شرط لها مع وزير الخارجية الأمريكي تريد أن تكرس الدولة اليهودية. هذا أمر خطير للغاية، وشكرا.
Well, 5 big ifs there from George Alam. But it seems, Kevorkian, that all of these ifs revolve around your country, Syria. So you've heard George's 5 ifs. You heard Dr. Yunus's somewhat pessimistic analysis. What's yours?
Yes, indeed. Actually, there is a very important equation in politics here in the Middle East, says that when Syria sneezes, Lebanon gets cold. This is the only equation that's happening now in the region, that since the beginning of the uprising or the movement, political movement in Syria, many political parties of Lebanon intervened in Syria, and namely the Future Movement. They sent their aid Oqab Sakr to Turkey, to Antakya, to control the armed flows and the mercenaries into Syria. But when you Afghanize your neighbor, you will become a Pakistan. This is the reality now. The spillover of the Syrian crisis now is a reality in Lebanon, and the bombings happening everywhere. And the point is, no one cares about Shias, no one cares about the Sunnis, no one cares about the Christians. This is a proxy war. These countries have interest in gas and other strategic interests. What's happening now, the regional states like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, they are raising the level of hostility between the sects, because in Syria, before the crisis, we have in politics the macro and micro identities. The Syrian regime, they succeeded to prevail the macro identity, which is the Syrian Arab identity. But since the beginning of the crisis in Syria, some people, they went to the micro identities. They start to identify themselves as Sunnis, Alawis, Shias, Christians, etc. This serves the best interest of Israel, because at the end of the day, we all know that Israel is promoting itself as a Jewish state. And if they don't have other sectarian and other religious states which neighboring Israel, its project will fail. This is one thing. The other thing that in the international community always blames Hezbollah for its interference in Syria. Personally, I believe also Hezbollah has interest in Syria as well as Iran, and it's a preemptive war against the terrorists. It's very ironic that the EU and the United States, they consider ISIS and Nusra as terrorist organizations, but at the same time, when Hezbollah fights these terrorist groups, they consider Hezbollah as a terrorist group. So this ironic situation now in the Middle East is deteriorating the situation more and more. And Geneva too will only solve the international aspect of the Syrian crisis, the interests of these regional states. But on the domestic level, how could we solve this hostility among the people? Because there are Syrians who carried weapons against the Syrian government, and on the other hand, they are also loyals of the government. They also carried weapons against other civilians. So we have terrorists, and also we have civilians, and also Syrians who carried these weapons. So how could we solve this situation? It's only by dialogue. This is what we promoted for since the beginning of the political crisis in Syria. But many opposition groups, they consider us as a beneficiaries from the regime, or we have some interest by the regime. No, this is logic. The Lebanese civil war, after 15 years and 20 years, it ended with dialogue, and it will end by dialogue in Syria. But how long it will, when we will reach into dialogue, this is the question. Today, Haitham Manna declared that he's not going to participate in Geneva II, because the UN sent the same letter that they sent to Jarba, that they are not considering the National Coordination Group of Haitham Manna as an independent party, but they want to include it with the coalition. This is the major problem, that we have oppositions in Syria. We have internal oppositions, and we also have patriotic oppositions outside. But on the other hand, we have also puppets. This is the reality. There are people who are having money, direct money, by Saudi Arabia and Qatar. I have friends who were with me in the university, and now they are in Turkey, and they are studying for free because they became opposition. So we have to see how to differentiate between the patriotic people who want to defend Syria and those who want the destruction of Syria, or to come into power in Syria on the tanks, on the tanks of the Americans or other parties.
Well, look, on one level, the big Western powers, France being a slight exception, but certainly the United States and the United Kingdom, on one level, are clear. They told the Syrian opposition in no uncertain terms in Paris just the other day that you must go to Geneva or we will stop supporting you. But John Kerry, alongside Mr. Lavrov, announced that Iran could come to Geneva, whilst the spokeswoman in Washington said that he didn't say that at all, even though we saw his lips move and we heard the words coming from his mouth. But in any case, all three of you are experts, are establishing the undeniable fact that Lebanon's security and community relations within Lebanon are intimately, vitally connected to the outcome in Syria. But all three of you are a little pessimistic, I think, that Geneva II is going to lead to any kind of solution anytime soon. But I want to test my alternative thesis that a process in Syria might actually only displace the terrorist activity into Lebanon. Of course, I hope, I pray that that will not happen. But I'm not so sure that winding down, relatively speaking, of the war in Syria necessarily means an equal reduction in tension here in Lebanon. Let's take some of the amateurs like me from the audience. Yes, the young man in the middle row.
محمد سقلاوي جامعة اللبنانية الدولية. مستر جورج، نحن بحالة خطر يلي هي إذا ما توحدوا العرب هلا نحن جايين على تقسيم بالمنطقة. ولما يجي هالتقسيم بالمنطقة نحن منهم قارينا لا سنة ولا شيعة، جاي التقسيم على اثنين. يعني نحن لازم نفهم فكرة وحدة، إنه نحن لازم نكون إيد وحدة. والفكرة الثانية اللي بدي أقولها، الحرب اللي عم بتصير بسوريا هي حرب أصلا مشروع الشرق الأوسط الجديد اللي حكي هو عنه هنري كيسنجر بالزمان، واللي هي تقسيم سوريا وعراق ومصر ولبنان لدولات صغار طائفية مذهبية. وحتى اللي عم بيدور هلا بسوريا واللي من وراها دول داعميتهم مثل السعودية وقطر ودعم طبيعي يعني وعلنا، هو اللي عم بيؤدي لهذا الشيء اللي صار هون. والخطر هو جاي على المنطقة، أنا بشوف إنه جاي على المنطقة بالتحديد وخاصة على لبنان. إذا ما نحن فهمنا اللعب اللي عم بتصير علينا، إنه نحن دائما إذا كل ما إنه طالما إسرائيل هي موجودة حدنا طالما حيكون في خطر علينا.
Well, yeah, of course, the Zionist pioneers and theoreticians dreamed of greater Israel. Of course, if they could, they would, but they can't, so they won't. Israel has enough trouble holding on to the occupied West Bank. It has a gigantic problem in the world. The world is decisively swinging against it. Haaretz just predicted that if the Washington talks fail, and nothing seems more certain than that Israel will face an existential threat to its existence by a wave of sanctions and boycott around the world. A third intifada could well be sparked. So Israel is in no position to expand anywhere. And we have to face, I think, the melancholy truth that the main problem in the Arab world is the Arabs, not the Israelis, not the Turks, not the Americans, not the British or the French, but the Arabs themselves. The carnage that we're watching in Syria is being paid for and armed by Arab governments and not by others. Let me go around the audience. Yes, gentleman in the front row.
Hi. My name is Omar Hilwi. I'm a leftist political activist. I would just want to add some few points upon what the previous fellows here just said. First of all, I would like to say that it's not Iran only and then Saudi Arabia that are the main major powers in this conflict. It's quite obvious that it's between the Russians and the Americans, because we know that Russia stands behind Iran and then the United States stands behind KSA. And then upon also what my fellow added here, it's a war based on they don't care if it's between Sunnah or Shia. It's mainly because of the gas and the resources. It's the same reasons why they launched the whole war on Iraq, to take over all the oil fields in all over Iraq. And then as for concerning Geneva 2 of its occurring, there's one more reason I don't think it's going to occur soon, and it's because the regime now is being victorious, and it's with the aid of all the people, of all the, well, let's just say, the support he is having, they are fulfilling victories on all over Syria upon the what they call themselves the revolutionists. So unless they maintain, they have a balance in power on the floor, a fire balance, or whatever you want, a fire power balance between both sides, or else it will not be an equal to equal talks. Because, you know, in Palestine, we've been, concerning the Palestinian issue, we've been losing throughout the years because the power is with Israel only, and the Palestinians, they are weak compared to the power the Israelis have.
Indeed, but the Palestinians are a people who are in an unbalanced negotiation with another state and with international interlocutors. The Syrian rebels are not a people. They don't speak for or represent any nation, any people. Most of the people doing the fighting in Syria are foreigners, have nothing to do with Syria. They're Chechens or Libyans or Saudis or British, Pakistanis. Yeah. So you can never get equal balance.
83 nationalities. 83 nationalities
83
fighting
nationalities,
Syria.
1,000 organizations.
Personally, I would be against Hezbollah if they leave Syria, not because they interfered in Syria. I'm with their interfering in Syria. It's a must to protect us.
Well, Hezbollah was the very last of the foreign fighters to arrive in Syria. And they arrived in Syria to fight against the foreign fighters who invaded it, as was pointed out earlier. Much more of this to come after this. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al-Mayadeen television, coming to you from Beirut, where an audience of experts and amateurs like me are discussing the security situation in Lebanon, how it is intimately tied to the security situation or lack of in Syria, and how or if the process known as Geneva II will reduce tensions in Lebanon, which have seen car bombings, indiscriminate slaughter, assassination of public officials, beginning to look ominously like the beginnings of a kind of civil strife on a widespread scale that we have seen too often in Lebanon in the past. We've heard from the experts. We'll be going back to them. Let's go to some more of the young people in the audience from Hizba Demokrati. Reem, is it your name, Reem? Welcome, please.
ريم حاتوم منتدى الشباب الديمقراطي. اللي أنا بدي أحكيه إنه رزمة من العيدان إذا جينا نكسرها ما فينا نكسرها كلها سوا، بس إذا جينا نكسر عود بينكسر. وهذا المخطط الإسرائيلي الأمريكي بعد الفشل بال2006 بأن إنه يحتلوا لبنان، فصاروا بده يقسموا الدويلات العربية لدويلات صغيرة ويحتلوها كل دويلة لحال ويسيطروا عليها. نحن كيف فينا نجابه هالشيء أو نحارب على الشيء اللي عم بيصير؟ بأنه نتحد، لأنه رب الدروز ورب الإسلام ورب المسيحية هو رب واحد، لا نحن نختلف على الأرض. فنحن بنكون قبل المؤتمرات وقبل كل اللي عم بيصير لما نكون متحدين بين بعض بنمنع أي شيء اللي عم بيصير بكل البلدان العربية. لازم نتحد بالأول ونروح نحكي بمؤتمرات إن كان جنيف ولا إن كان بغير مؤتمرات تانية.
I mean, this is very clear. What I have been saying since the beginning of Al-Mayadeen, that this Sykes-Picot II idea, which they have been pursuing, is exactly about what Kavorian said about macro and micro identity. First of all, Zionism has a clear interest in having around it countries which are based entirely on sectarian or confessional bases. Secondly, the big powers would rather face 500 Arab Emirates, especially if those Emirates could be fighting with each other, arguing with each other, filled with tension with each other. Then they could sell weapons to them all. They could sell weapons to the armies of 500 Arab countries. And every now and again they could make some of them fight each other, and this is like a dream for them. The question for the Arabs is, do they believe in their macro identity? Never mind as Arabs, but even as Lebanese, even as Syrians. Never mind the macro identity as Arabs. Reem.
أنا ما بلوم الرؤساء والنواب والوزراء، أنا بلوم الشباب. يعني نحن كشباب ما لازم نترك حالنا نوصل لهون. لازم نحن مش بآمنين إنه نحن فينا نعيش مع بعض ولبعض. ليتا نسأل أنت شو دينك أو أنت شو طائفتك أو أنت، مجرد نآمن نحن بالإنسان الموجود. يعني نآمن بالإنسانية. بتتصوروا أنتوا اللي عم بيصير بسوريا هو بيخدم الإنسان أو بيخدم الإنسانية؟ مئات الناس اللي عم بتموت بسوريا هيدا شيء مقبول نحن برأينا كشباب. أنا هيدا اللي بدي أسأله، نحن لازم نبلش بالثورة مش الرؤساء والنواب.
Reem, you are a dream. Thank you for that very important contribution to this debate. I would only say this to you, don't blame the youth. Don't blame the youth, because actually the youth never got their hands on power to organize the Arab states. The people who are running the Arab states, by and large, are 80 or 90 years old. The youth are the hope for the future. Gentleman in the front row, yes.
Greetings, Mr. Galloway. Hussein Kabisi, amateur political analyst. I just wanted to touch on the Saudi role in the region. It's believed by many that Saudi Arabia is playing a destructive role in the region, you know, by arming and funding extremists throughout the region, such as in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. But today it seems clearer by the day that the Saudi policies have failed, and that Iran and its allies on the other side are actually emerging on top. My question is, do you think that Saudi Arabia will be made to pay the price by the states and the nations that have suffered actually from the Saudi role in the region?
Well, my prediction from the beginning of the US turn, when they didn't attack and invade Syria directly and opened a channel of negotiations with Iran, is that both of the US client states, most obvious client states in this region, namely Israel and Saudi Arabia, would have to follow suit. They can bark, but they are not the dog, they are the tail of the dog. And now they are barking. But actually, neither Israel nor the Saudi regime could survive for 5 minutes without the United States wherewithal, money, weapons, political and diplomatic support. So in the end, and maybe it's already happening, Saudi Arabia will have to open channels to the government in Damascus and begin to wind down its engagement in this war. And Israel, for all its barking about the Iranian nuclear deal, will have to pipe down. There is now no possibility of an Israeli attack on Iran. This is simply impossible. There is now no possibility of a Western attack on Syria. This is simply impossible. So in the absence of that, all that can happen is in favor of some kind of negotiated solution. What that negotiated solution will be or will look like and with whom it will be negotiated is, I think, still open to a lot of question. And the ambition, even 12 months ago, was that they would overthrow the government in Damascus, that Bashar al-Assad would be executed or exiled, that the black flag of al-Qaeda would be flying in Damascus. This ambition is now completely abandoned, but they are trying to make a sectarian country in the parts of Iraq and the parts of Syria where they are still militarily strong. And you can see, I saw on television today for the first time, a map of what such a sectarian state would look like if it was carved out of Iraq and Syria. But it looked ridiculous to me. It would have no oil resources. It would have no international recognition beyond the immediate neighbors. And I don't believe it's going to happen. Yes, quick.
So the fact that it needs American pressure for the Saudis to pull back, the next question would then be, how long would that take? The leader of the Lebanese resistance, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, in a recent speech said that the Saudis, perhaps weeks or months ago, would be working and acting in the region, perhaps semi-blind, right? But now they're completely blind. So how long would the Americans allow the Saudi tail, if you like, to continue, working in the region?
Well, the relationship is not quite the dog to the tail. The tail has some opportunity to wag independently, but very limited. And that's what the tail is now doing. But here's my prediction. I have no inside knowledge about this. My prediction is that Saudi Arabia and Qatar have already opened channels to Bashar al-Assad in Damascus. I'm sure about that because it's obvious that their project has failed. And I believe that it will not be that long, perhaps a year, before you begin to see meetings between the Syrian and Saudi and Qatari leadership again. We are used to this in the Arab world. Things can change very quickly. Only takes a few drops of rain to transform the landscape. Yes, gentleman in the middle row.
حيدر حمود الجامعة اللبنانية الدولية. أنا بس بدي أعطي تشبيه للأزمة اللي لها ممتدة كم سنة بسوريا. أنا برأيي اللي عم بيصير بسوريا مع الأسف حيكون تشبيه فكاهي نوعا ما. هو مثل مباراة كرة قدم. الملعب هو سوريا. المباراة قايمة بين القوى الكبرى بالعالم، يعني بين الولايات المتحدة وبين روسيا. اللي عم يلعبوا بالمباراة هن أطراف عديدة أبرزها حزب الله والسعودية وقطر وإلى آخره. بس مش حاطين حكم للمباراة مع الأسف. لا يقدر، عشان لو في حكم كان حطوا الأمم المتحدة حكم. لو في أمم متحدة أساسا مزبوط. هاي واحد. وأنا برأيي المباراة فعليا هي 90 دقيقة، بس رايحة 90 سنة هيدي المباراة إذا ما أكتر كمان. والمباراة معروف مين الفائز. الفائز حيكون الكيان الصهيوني، والخاسر هو الوطن العربي أو العالم العربي إذا في حدا عنده تعقيب على كلمة وطن عربي. هاي واحد. الشغلة الثانية اللي بدنا نربطها بالشغلة الأولى بالمباراة، أنا برأيي أستاذ جورج إنه الزمن بيعيد نفسه دايماً. الزمن بيعيد نفسه. بالحرب العالمية الثانية كان في القوة النازية والفاشستية إيطاليا وألمانيا، وكان في اليابان، كانوا عم بيواجهوا الحلفاء بأوروبا فرنسا وبريطانيا إلى آخره. وبالآخر وصلوا الألمان إلى ستالينغراد، بعدين ابتدأت المقاومة الروسية من هونيك، وصلوا لبرلين بعدين، وبالآخر وصلوا الولايات المتحدة وكبوا قنبلة ذرية على اليابان، وهن صاروا الانتصار من روسيا من بعد ما كان أساسا هن دخلهم بالحرب. وأنا أخشى ما أخشاه الآن بهيدي الأيام إنه إسرائيل قاعدة على جنب، وأخشى ما أخشاه مثل ما صار بالحرب العالمية الثانية. أمريكا كانت على جنب بالحرب العالمية الثانية وتدخلت فجأة وحسمت الحرب، وأخشى كمان برجع بقول لك بطريقة معينة تتدخل إسرائيل وتحسم هذا الحرب. وما بستبعد أنا أبدا عشان شعبنا مستحيل فيه. وشكرا.
Brother, I know why you say that, but I honestly don't believe that it's true. I believe you're overestimating the power of Israel. It doesn't have the power to come off the benches and change the game. As a matter of fact, the tide has turned in a very decisive way, and your allegory of Stalingrad is a very good one. Actually, the Second World War was won at Stalingrad, because every day after Stalingrad was a bad day for the Nazis. And the United States dropped these bombs, as you say, to try to steal the victory. But they had the power to do so, and Israel does not. Kavorian, a lot of talk about your country. Would you like to respond to some of the points that have been made?
Yes, actually, in the Middle East, we have now two destructive forces. Okay, the Zionist state with its military force, and the Wahhabi state in KSA with its ideological force. These two forces are destructing the area. And they are exchanging the destruction of the Middle East. For example, in Syria, I will give you an example. This Wahhabi ideology is very odd for the Syrian people. They never heard about it, they never practiced it, but once for a sudden, a lot of people change their minds. Some people believe it is Sunnis fighting Alawites. It's not. These Sunnis, they fall in the trap of Wahhabism. These people, when they become Takfiris, they are no longer Sunnis. They are Wahhabis, because the Sunnis never tell people to cut the heads. This is the Islam of Abdul Wahhab, and also the Ikhwan al-Muslimin in the region. So now this conflict between the Wahhabism against all other sects and ideologies, it's not only against the Alawis or the Shias. Sunnis themselves suffered a lot of killings and a lot of people kidnapped. For myself, I'm from Aleppo. It is a Sunni city. The vast majority of the Aleppis were against the opposition. But these rebels the mercenaries who came from Turkey, they stole all the factories of these people because Aleppo is an industrial city, and they transferred all these equipments into Turkey. Now, these people are also a very big block of Sunnis, and they are against the opposition. So it's totally untrue that it is Sunni, Shia, or it is a matter.
Most of the Syrian army are Sunni.
Sunnis, yes, 80% of them
Most of the victims of these terrorists have been Sunni because most of the people in Syria are Sunni.
Yes,
and a car bomb doesn't discriminate between the faith of the person that it explodes amongst.
Mr. George, I will mention an example. Last week I was watching a video of executions for Syrian soldiers, and before the execution they are asking the sect of each soldier, and they executed 10 soldiers, 8 of them were Sunnis. And they are telling them, are you Sunni and you are fighting us? And they are amazed, you know, because they thought that they are fighting only Alawites or Shias in Syria. And then they were surprised that even the Sunnis are fighting them. This is one. The second example, in 2012, when the FSA was controlling the northern suburb of Aleppo, and they called them the moderate rebels in the west. The Liwa al-Tawhid, they kidnapped my brother in Aleppo, and they took them into Anadan. And during the interrogation, the first question is, what's your sect? And when they knew he is a Christian, they beat him because he born Christian. He didn't choose his religion, you know. And when my brother was trying to tell them that I am not with the regime, I'm with the opposition, and I was going to protest, and they told him Christians don't go to protest. So this is the problem. It's not what you perceive yourself, what the others perceive you. If I consider myself as a Syrian, but the other side is considering me as a Christian, so I'm infidel, so he has the right to kill me. This is the problem.
Let's take the young man behind you. Go ahead, sir.
والد عايبس منتدى الشباب الديمقراطي. يعني سياسة الدول الكبيرة الكبرى وأهدافها وتاريخ الدول بالتخطيط وبالعقلية الغربية وكيفية طريقة التفكير بتسمح لأننا نكون فكرة عن الحرب السورية. الحرب السورية هي تخطيط، إذا ما نسمي نعطيها شكل من أشكال الحروب للحرب السورية بوجهة نظرية يعني معينة، فينا نعطيها نظرية الحرب دولية مش حرب أهلية، لأن حرب التخصيص حرب أمريكانية سورية وغربية، حرب سورية، لأن شو اسمه كان مخطط. إذا بنقشع اللي بيقرأ تاريخ واللي بيدرس التاريخ كيف كانوا يخططوا الغرب والدول الكبيرة، تخطيطاتهم كانت تكون على مدى طويل وتحقيق هدف وراء هدف ليوصلوا لمآلهم ولما يريدوا. يعني نفهم الحرب السورية كان مخطط الغرب أو الأمريكاني بعد انتصار حزب الله ولبنان جميعه، وحزب الله ليس أو المقاومة اللبنانية ليست حكر لا على طائفة معينة ولا لشخص معين. بعد انتصاره بال2006 بلش يشكل خطر على إسرائيل، وبما أنه شكل خطر على إسرائيل بمحاولة حماية إسرائيل بالشرق، خططوا المصدر الغذائي الوحيد كان سوريا لحزب الله في لبنان. خططوا بالقضاء على سوريا ومن ثم القضاء على حزب الله، ويتفرغوا للقضية الإيرانية هي القضية النووية. بما أن مخططهم مش فشل بلش يفشل، اتجهوا من بوادر اتجهوا للاتفاق النووي الإيراني. فينا نستنتج من هالنقطة هي من جهة الحرب السورية. وبما حكوا كثير إنه في حدا أستاذ من الأساتذة قال إنه سوريا تشعر بالبرد ولبنان يمرض. نحن الشباب ما راح نفكر بالطريقة، بدنا نفكر بأمة عربية وحدة، بشعب عربي واحد لنكون قوية. أمريكا دولة فيدرالية متكون من 50 دولة على ما أظن، من 50 دولة. ليش ما نكونش نحن العرب دولة وحدة وقوية اقتصاديا وعالميا وسياسيا؟ فينا نقول إنه لبنان بالشرق الأوسط أو بالأمة العربية كالخي الكبير للعرب كلهم سوا. وأبسط أمثال لما صارت الحرب والسلام الإسرائيلي بفلسطين، تهجم من فلسطين وكان مستقبله أول مستقبل لهم لبنان، اللي رفضت فلسطينية أغلب الدول رفضت أنه تستقبلهم وتشكلوا بمخيمات. واليوم الحرب بسوريا كمان لاجئين من عندها استقبلهم لبنان، لأنه لبنان دولة عربية واحدة خلينا ننظر له من الأخ الكبير بالأمة العربية، خلينا ننظر له من هالمنظر. ومن جهة اللاجئين السوريين وتأثيره على لبنان، يعني عم نحكي مليون لاجئ سوري، مليون لاجئ. إذا ما نقول 1% منهم ناس مش مناح، يعني 1% 10,000، يعني أكيد بتشكلوا خطر، منهم مغتصبين، منهم قتلة، منهم انتحاريين، منهم إرهابيين، أكيد بتشكلوا خطر. ووضعهم بسوريا اللي عم يرجع لورا أدى إلى ظهور هذه الانفجارات في لبنان من مبدأ ضعف وفتح الحرب في سوريا ولبنان حرب واحدة لكي تتسع أقاليمهم وتنفتح لهم مجالات أكثر. شكرا.
Dr. Yunus, Lebanon, the big brother of the Arabs.
I'm skeptical about that because
I'm
usually
a bit skeptical myself.
I'm very skeptical about that.
But these young people from
I
this
highly thank him for
Hezbollah
endowing.
are very clever
I
people.
highly thank him for endowing us with this role. But I think that the big brother has a leading role in the region. We are following in all the strategies which are being formulated in the region. In fact, when Reem was talking, I was reflecting a bit. I was reflecting on my principles. I think that this reflection has given me an understanding that Reem's talk was a bit poetic, unfortunately. A few years ago, I was as dreamer as Reem is. However, what has happened in Syria has given me an understanding that to have a dialogue, to have an agreement, to have a negotiation, your partner in the negotiation has to be a human. But what we are witnessing in Syria doesn't have this sense of humanity. Not at all. Our colleague here has said that there are 83 nations, 1,000 bands fighting in Syria in a non-humanitarian sense. So this, unfortunately, has given me a belief that the highest voice is the voice of the battlefield. And what has the progress and the victories of the Syrian government on ground has endowed has given Syria, the Syrian government, the upper hand in any potential negotiation. Has given Russia and the G8 and the G20 the upper hand with respect to their rivals in the negotiation, namely the US. The U-turn of the US regarding the nuclear weapons of Iran and regarding canceling the strike on Syria was due to this upper hand, which Russia has acquired due to the victories of Syria. And I guess that the escalation and the postponing of Geneva II is due to this potential power that Syria might have. Unfortunately, Kevork has said that when Syria coughs, we get the cold. The whole world is coughing in Syria, giving the viruses to Syria, and we are getting the cold. It's also unfortunate. Sorry for being pessimistic. Usually I'm highly positive, but what's happening around is giving me this sense of pessimism. And our colleague here said that we can't only talk about Iran and KSA. The other powers are sitting together on the negotiation tables in the P5+1 and G8 and the G20. But the proximity between Saudi Arabia and Iran is being the biggest. The gap is being the widest. That's why we need to have a proximity in the relation between these two major powers so that it might reflect positively in Lebanon. I think that the moment they sit together, the major powers in Lebanon, the 14th of March, will have the green light to form the cabinet.
Well, I think 2 points have to be made, but I'll have to go to the break now. But I just signpost them. First of all, Hezbollah's intervention in the war has been important. Russian diplomatic and political skill has been important. But the real principal reason why these fanatics have not won is because of the Syrian people themselves, the majority of whom have clung to the macro identity as Syrians and as Arabs. Second point has to be made, it seems like a contradiction. Because most of the fighting is being done by foreign fighters does not mean that there are not many Syrians against their regime. There are many Syrians against their regime. Although paradoxically there are probably fewer today against their regime than at the beginning of this process. because when things get worse, cling to nurse, as we say in English. People have flocked to the banner of the state because of the ugliness of those who are challenging it. But that doesn't mean there isn't someone to negotiate with. There are Syrians to negotiate with. They just have to decide to shake themselves free and separate themselves from the foreign fanatics. We'll continue this right after the break. Welcome back to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al-Mayadeen television in Beirut. We're discussing with an audience of amateurs and experts. I'm the amateur, as I keep saying, but the experts are the likes of George George, are the Lebanese people in for a return to the 1970s, or can this be somehow diffused, somehow controlled? Will I be able to come back here next month for Kalima Horra? Tell me.
أرجوك أولا احسبني من الهواة وليس من الخبراء، لكن سأجيب. بطبيعة الحال الشعب اللبناني هو عريق في حواره، رغم أن التيارات السياسية الخارجية سواء كانت عربية أو إقليمية كانت دائما تتلاعب بمشاعره، لأن غالبية القيادات كان لها انتماءات خارجية ولا تزال. لكن التجربة اللبنانية هي تجربة حية، مرت هذه التجربة بكثير من التحديات سواء من قبل إسرائيل وغير إسرائيل، وأثبتت متانتها. وباعتقادي أن هذا التنوع في لبنان دفع ربما قداسة البابا الراحل إلى وصف لبنان بالرسالة. باعتقادي ليس هناك من تفريط بهذه الرسالة من معظم أو من جميع العائلات الروحية في لبنان، لكن الكلمة ليست للبنان. لبنان هو دائما الساحة، ساحة التجاذبات. وإذا سمحت لي أن أحاول مقاربة المشهد لكل بأن لبنان الجزء في العالم العربي لم يحظى بهذه المكانة التي تليق بدوره وبرسالته، لأنه كان دائما يحتضن النزاعات العربية، التشوهات ما بين الأنظمة العربية، وكان دائما يتحمل المسؤولية الكبرى. العالم العربي بحد ذاته باعتقادي كان منقسما إلى محورين. عندما كان الاتحاد السوفيتي والحرب الباردة مع الولايات المتحدة كان العالم العربي فريق مع الاتحاد السوفيتي، آخر مع الولايات المتحدة. عندما طبعا زال الاتحاد السوفيتي أصبح معظم الأنظمة، اسمح لي أتحدث عن أنظمة وليس عن شعوب، معظم الأنظمة العربية تابعة للولايات المتحدة، وهو ما زال قائما حتى الآن، بخلاف بسيط في المشهد السوري حيث دخل الروسي من جديد على خط الشرق الأوسط. في الصراع مع إسرائيل كان هناك بطبيعة الحال عدة قرارات للصمود والتصدي. كان هناك مجلس الدفاع العربي المشترك. ماذا قدم هذا المجلس الدفاع العربي المشترك من الصراع مع إسرائيل؟ لا شيء. وباعتقادي هنا لابد من أن نذكر، وطبعا بعلامة فارقة جدا، البطولات التي قدمها حزب الله في الجنوب، واللي استطاع أن يؤكد للعرب بأنه إذا كانت هناك إرادة فعلا للقتال فهذه الإرادة هي السلاح الأمضى والأقوى من كل الأسلحة والتكنولوجيات، وهذا الأمر لم يحصل. الشرق الأوسط الجديد اليوم تتحكم فيه دول 3 كبرى: تركيا، إيران، إسرائيل. أما فيما يتعلق بالخليج العربي فأنا أعتقد جازما بأنها محميات أمريكية. من يحمي هذه الدول هو الولايات المتحدة، وبالتالي حتى تصبح هناك نهضة عربية جديدة علينا أن ننتظر ربما قرونا من الزمن لكي تأخذ كل دولة عربية نظامها، شكلها، تفاهماتها. عندئذ ربما يصبح هناك جامعة عربية فاعلة، وأنا أستبعد ذلك، لأن الدول الكبرى تقول عليكم بجامعة إقليمية تشارك فيها إسرائيل، تشارك فيها إيران، تشارك فيها تركيا إلى ما هنالك. أرى بأننا ذاهبون نحو هذا المنحى. لبنان دون أن نشك يتأثر بكل هذه الصراعات. السؤال الذي يقلقني: هل إذا ذهبت سوريا إلى أقاليم مذهبية سيبقى لبنان موحدا؟ سؤال لا جواب عليه، لكنه خطر قائم.
Thanks, George. Let's take the young man at the back. Yes, back in the corner with the glasses.
غسان نبيل، الجامعة اللبنانية الدولية قسم الإعلام. لو سمحت بس بدي أسألك سؤال عن مين بشكل اليوم غطاء سياسي لكثير من الجماعات يعني التكفيرية والمتشددة إسلاميا بلبنان. والشق الثاني من السؤال انه بكثير من القنوات الاخباريه عم نشوف انه عم بنزج المخيمات الفلسطينيه بكثير من الاشياء ما خص، خلينا نقول المخيمات ككل، بالشيء اللي عم بيصير بانحاء لبنان. يعني هي عباره مش عن محطه نقلب التشانل كل يوم لحتى يعني نشوف شو الشيء اللي صار بطرابلس وخلص خلصنا. يعني انه طرابلس بعد ما صار هذا العنف اللي صار بطرابلس شو طلع مع السياسيين؟ ليش عم بيقولوا العالم دائما انه في ماجد الماجد، الاسير فضل شاكر دائما بيطلعوا من المخيمات مثلا؟ بس حب انه اعرف شو وجهة نظرك من هذا الموضوع بالنسبة للمخيمات الفلسطينية.
Well, look, the devil finds work for idle hands, and there are hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees who are forced into idleness. And of course, the mass poverty and the immiseration in these camps means you will always find someone who can be purchased for the devil's work, no doubt. But we shouldn't fall into the trap of blaming the Palestinian refugees for sectarianism in Lebanon. They are cocooned in these camps, separate from the political dynamics in this country. I have my own theory that the great majority of the Sunni Arab population in Lebanon is not looking for a sectarian battle with their neighbors. They know, most of them, what civil war looks like. They know that any war could not possibly result in any kind of victory for them, and so they don't want it. My impression, you'll know better than me, living here all the time, is that the number of Wahhabist fanatics in Lebanon is very small. But those small numbers have firepower, and above all, they have money, and it's coming from the Gulf. We don't need to name names. Everybody knows who we're talking about. But that's why I said at the beginning, the main problem in the Arab world is the Arabs. It's not the Israelis or anybody else. And until we can reach a situation where these tyrants in the Gulf are stopped by somebody from spreading their poison by the use of their money, we're always going to have a disproportionate bang produced by these bucks. But my belief is the vast majority of Lebanese people do not want a war with each other. Yes, sir. Welcome back.
Thank you. David Zaidi from the Lebanese International University. Let me talk about the security issues inside Lebanon, since nobody wanted to tackle it directly. I really don't believe that a power like Hezbollah would be stupid enough to attack somebody inside Lebanon like 2 weeks ago. I think it was Mohammed Shatih, his name. Because they have such big progress going on in Syria. Why would they attack somebody inside Lebanon? And I think the people who are doing those car bombs are the people waging a full-scale war around the world using car bombs. This has been the way in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Sudan, all over the world, actually. So, and on the other hand, you would want to see, and why would Syria or Hezbollah, with all their progress they're making throughout this war, attack somebody like Shatih inside Lebanon, or blow up something in Dahi just to create the Stockholm Syndrome within people, when we know that the people who always use the Stockholm Syndrome to gain sympathy of people they're harming has always been the USA and its allies, and we know who its allies are in Lebanon.
Well, it's extremely difficult to know who is doing what in a hall of mirrors. You'll be familiar with the great English writer Graham Greene and his novel, The Quiet American, made into a film starring Michael Caine. This showed you from the early 1960s how easy it is for people to hoist false flags, to set off bombs and cause destruction so that the other will be blamed.
9/11,
so
Pearl
that,
Harbor.
Sorry?
9/11 and Pearl Harbor.
Well, I don't think so in either of those two cases, but we'll have to have another television program about that. I believe that 9/11 was carried out by these very takfiri fanatics, or people who are motivated by that mindset. I believe that Pearl Harbor was carried out by Japanese fascism. But we can debate that on another day. We want to hear from some more of the audience here. Reem, you've been in already. Let's go to the young man at the back, please.
نادر أبو حلا، الجامعة اللبنانية الدولية. اليوم برأيك الصراع الدائر بين المجموعات المسلحة بسوريا بغض النظر عن تسمياتهم داعش ولا النصرة أو الجبهة الإسلامية، يعني مش الهدف منها إظهار طرف غير النظام السوري أو الجيش العربي السوري إنه عم بيحارب الإرهاب ليكون مقبول للغرب ليمثل المعارضة بمؤتمر جنيف 2؟ هذا السؤال الأول. السؤال الثاني، شو الهدف من جر لبنان لحرب أو إدخال لبنان لحرب إن كان من المحورين المتصارعين روسيا أو أمريكا، دخل لبنان بحرب وموجود العراق ساحة مفتوحة؟
Well, I think the state of affairs in Iraq and in Syria is so bad that there is no international support for a war in Lebanon. I say international, but I don't exclude the existence of people in the Gulf who would like to see the war in Lebanon break out and the flames to spread. I think there's every possibility that such people exist. I'm sure that the international patrons of these countries are putting pressure on them to desist. But the facts are that the situation in Lebanon is now shaky. The facts are that people are being blown up in horrific car bombs, and we have absolutely no guarantee that there won't be another one tonight or tomorrow. Now, if the purpose of these bombs is to entice the Lebanese resistance into a full-scale conflict, this will fail, because the leadership of the Lebanese resistance is far too wise to be drawn into such an obvious trap. And it takes two to tango, it takes two to make a war. But that would still leave open the possibility of a process of attrition, of terrorist attack after attack after attack, laying waste to large numbers of people in Lebanon. The first part of your question again was what?
المتصارعة بجنيف بسوريا عشان مؤتمر جنيف.
Yeah, it's a good one.
إظهار طرف على حساب الآخر.
It's a good point. This conflict is real. Kevorian will tell us, I think, if he disagrees. This is a real conflict. These fanatics, having failed in their project, are now turning upon each other. These are real deaths. Hundreds are being killed by each other's fanatic faction. It's an alphabet soup. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria and all these different groups are now turning on each other and murdering each other. And of course, there are people who will emerge victorious in that. So we have to find Syrians to negotiate with. The regime needs people to negotiate with. And if others are joining the fight to destroy these most extreme fanatics, hallelujah, the more of them who are destroyed, the better from my point of view. Not least because they're only going to come back to Britain and other places when they leave Syria. Just yesterday, the British police arrested 2 of them at Birmingham airport on their way back from Turkey. It's a very real danger, and the British state now recognizes it. Unfortunately, just a little bit too late. Who on this side who hasn't spoken yet? Yes, madam.
سارة فرحات من الأيو. نحن الثورات بلشت عنا من تونس ولحقتها ليبيا ومصر وسوريا واليمن والبحرين. كل هيدول الثورات أثرت علينا شيء سلبا، وعم نشوف التشدد الإسلامي بتونس ومصر كمان الدم واصل للركب، وسوريا عم تأثر علينا بشكل عام على الوضع اللبناني. أنا بس بدي أسأل، هي الديمقراطية عنا فكرة حقيقية ولا هي مفهوم نحلم فيه بس ما بيتنفذ أبدا؟ وهل نحن شعوب بتليق فيها الديكتاتورية أكثر من الديمقراطية؟ يعني عم نشوف الديمقراطية اللي كان يسعى لها العرب شو عم تحقق بسوريا. الديمقراطية عم تحقق لنا بس قتل ودمار وكره أكثر لبعضنا. نحن بنحلم بالإنسانية بس هي أبدا فكرة ما بتتحقق. وأنا كنت إنه أقول شيء حلو إنه نكون إنسانيين، بس أبدا ما في شيء اسمه إنسانية بالدنيا، لأنه نحن محكومين للباك جراوند اللي عنا traditions وكل شيء. وثانك يو.
Well, I'm very sorry that you feel that way, and I understand why you do, but it's very sad to hear it from such a young person. First of all, revolution is a process and not an event. A revolution is not something that happens like a cup final in a football match in one day. The French Revolution took 10 years. The Bolshevik Revolution, 6 or 7 years from its beginning to the final defeat of the imperialist invasion of Soviet territory. So we're right at the beginning of a process of revolution in the Arab world. And in a revolution, you will take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes 1 step forward, 2 steps back. But the process will continue. I don't share your analysis of what's happened so far. Tunisia had a brute dictatorship. Now it has a democracy. It's a very noisy and quarrelsome democracy, and they all seem to hate each other with a vengeance. But they can all speak. They all have a radio station, a television station, a newspaper. They can all march and demonstrate, and they can all vote. And by the way, if the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt had been as well led as the Nahda in Tunisia, they might still be in office now. Because Sheikh Rashid Ghanouchi, by leaving the government in Tunisia, I give you a prediction. When the Tunisian election comes soon, Nahda will be stronger after the next election than they were at the last election. But whether I'm right or whether I'm wrong, in Tunisia they are going to freely choose their government, which is what democracy means. I quoted Churchill at the beginning, let me quote him towards the end. That democracy, said Mr. Churchill, is the worst form of government except for all the others. That's the truth of the matter. With all of its problems, it has to be better than all the others. If you didn't have a political system here in Lebanon, I don't agree with every dot and comma of that system, and I certainly don't agree with many of the political leaders in Lebanon. But if you didn't have a political system here, if you had a dictator here, there would be absolute carnage in Lebanon. It's only because of the safety valve of political maneuvering and parties and parliaments and presidents that you have any kind of social peace in Lebanon at all, in my view. Let's go, yes, to the back. Go ahead.
محمد قليط، صحافي وناشط حقوقي. إذا كنا بدنا نحكي من منطلق جيوسياسي حاليا اللي عم بيصير بسوريا، وأنا أكيد بوافق اللي ذكر قبل عن موضوع إذا عطست بسوريا لبنان بينال البرد، لأن بالأخير نحن بمنطقة الشام، إن كنا بسوريا فلسطين لبنان أو الأردن، الوضع كله متعلق ببعضه، وهذا واضح عبر الأزمة السورية اللي عم بتصير حاليا. ولكن اللي عم بيصير مع المعارضة السورية هو تنافس بين العهد السابق القطري التركي بدعم الجيش السوري الحر أو ما يسمى بالجيش السوري الحر، واستلام إقليمي جديد للسعودية لملف المنطقة بشكل عام. لأن حاليا لما السعودية برز دورة بشكل كتير كبير، بينما كان قطر هي كانت سيدة الموقف بالمنطقة ككل. منشوف كمان الاشتباكات اللي عم بتصير حاليا بشمال سوريا ما بين داعش والجبهة الإسلامية والنصرة مع الجبهة الإسلامية، وبالأساس بدنا نرجع لأساس هول المجموعات، مين ممولة، مين عم بيعطيها السلاح، من وين جايبين العتاد. الجبهة الإسلامية تأسست عبر زهران علوش اللي هو متمول بشكل كتير كبير من المملكة العربية السعودية. جبهة النصرة وداعش هما والدتا القاعدة التابعة لأيمن الظواهري اللي كان قائدها السابق بن لادن، ابن أكبر تاجر وصاحب أكبر شركات بالسعودية. فنحن عم نشوف مسرحية بالأحرى وليست حرب داخلية بين المعارضة السورية المتطرفة، وبذلك عم بيجربوا يلغوا من الأساس الجيش السوري الحر، وشفنا كثير من تعديات من الجبهة الإسلامية وداعش سويا ضد الجيش السوري الحر من أجل إلغاء الإرث القطري التركي بقلب سوريا. وبنشوف بنفس الوقت أنه الجيش السوري الحر اللي هو طلع نوعا ما أكثريته إذا مش كله من الشعب السوري أكيد بتحريض غربي وعربي لإسقاط نظام الأسد، عم نشوف انه هول الجنود عم بيرجعوا شوي شوي ينضبوا مع النظام السوري. اما لبنانيا كما نلاحظ هلا انه داعش والجماعات المتطرفه مشغوله جدا بحالها بشمال سوريا من اجل هالمسرحيه، وايضا بالعراق بنشوف انه بلبنان خف الوضع كثير بهالاسبوعين باستثناء الانفجار اللي فشل نوعا ما بحاره حرك، والحمد لله ما ادى لاضرار اكبر واكبر رغم انه خسرنا كثير شباب بهذا الموضوع ان كان جرحى او ضحايا. فبنشوف انه الوضع بلبنان رق شوي، وهيدا اللي عم بيصير حاليا بالمنطقه هي كلها لعبه جيوسياسيه، معارضه سعوديه للقرار الامريكاني الروسي اللي بده يوصل للحل السلمي بسوريا، وايضا اللي بده يوصل لاتفاق مع ايران على الموضوع النووي اللي بيريح ايران اقتصاديا، بنفس الوقت بيعطيها عافيه شويه ترجع تبني حالها من اول وجديد بعد النكسات اللي تعرضتها بسبب الكسره الاقتصاديه. عشان هيك اسرائيل والسعوديه كانوا اول معارضتين لموضوع جنيف السوري والاتفاق الغربي الايراني اللي بيريح ايران اكثر واكثر. وان كنا بدنا نحكي من منطلق انساني، وجود داعش والجبهة الإسلامية وغيرهم بسوريا إن كانوا معارضة أو موالاة للنظام أو لأي أنظمة عربية ولو حتى كانوا ضد إسرائيل، هذا بنفس الوقت عم بيهدد أي جماعات تانية من الفكر الآخر. وكما ذكرت حضرتك أستاذ جورج أن السنة هن المهددين قبل الشيعة والدروز والعلوية. الموضوع سياسي في سوريا وليس طائفي، يأخذ منحى طائفي بس لتغطيته للعب على الغرائز، ولكن الموضوع بسوريا سياسي بامتياز، وموضوع بلبنان سياسي بامتياز وليس طائفي كما يتكلمون البعض. أنا ابن حارة حريك، أنا ابن الضاحية.
I wish.
بس من بعد اذنك استاذ جورج، انا ابن حاره حريك وانا ابن الضاحيه وانا ساكن بالمنطقه محاوطينا كلها براضي مكسوره ودماء على الارض من ضحايا اللي معظمهم كانوا رفقاتي وخسرتهم بسبب هذه التعديات الارهابيه. وبنفس الوقت انا مثل ما حزنت وبكيت على ضحايا الضاحيه، بكيت وحزنت على ضحايا ستاركو وضحايا طرابلس وحتى الضحايا اللي راحوا بالبقاع، لان نحن كشعب لبناني كما ذكرت ريما إذا بنتوحد كلبنانية بداية وكشعب عربي ثانيا نحن ما حنوصل على المطرح، لأن إسرائيل هي أول من يتربص بنا وأمريكا تساعدها، وهناك للأسف دول عربية تساند هاتان الكيان الغاصب، وهذه الدولة الأمريكية تساندهم لقتل هذه الفكر القومي العربي والإنسانية العربية. أنا شفت الموت بعيوني وأنا بوعدهم إنه أنا حخبر الله كل شيء عن اللي عملوه. وشكرا.
Well, I don't have time to deal with every point that you made, but I want to say something I've said here before. It's a very big mistake to imagine that our enemies are James Bond. They're not James Bond, they're Austin Powers. They are idiots. They make mistake after mistake after mistake. Their power is waning. The United States, we heard from George about Arab regimes that are clinging to the United States. The United States empire is fading visibly in front of our eyes. So if there's anybody holding on to their coattails, they'd be better to let go sooner rather than later before that power disappears altogether. The idea that Britain and France, two bankrupt European countries who can't even pay their own electricity bills, are capable of, like chess players, moving 350 million Arabs around, 1.7 billion Muslims around, according to their will in a theatrical play, is just wrong. It's just wrong. I know that because I was there. I was one of the most central people to the decision of the British Parliament by just 13 votes not to make war on Syria just a month or two ago. Believe me, I was there. Every vote counted. Every word spoken counted. It could easily have been not 13 against the war, but 13 for the war. And then Obama would have launched the war already. And we would now be talking in the middle of a war between the West and Syria, and by extension Iran, and by extension Russia and China. That's how close it was. There was nobody in a theatrical play deciding to pretend to do this but actually do that. It came down to a balance of political force and argument. That's why I think so many of you are too pessimistic. In fact, the people who have caused the Arabs such misery over more than a century are fading. They are dying as powers. And if they came to Lebanon, Hezbollah would give them another bloody good hiding. So don't imagine that these adversaries who have caused you so much misery are destined to do so for decade after decade into the future. You are strong. I'm with Reem. I'm a dreamer with Reem. You are 350 million people, from the Atlantic to the Gulf, from Marrakesh to Bahrain. If you could only see yourselves as that, one Arab people with one language, you could be a superpower and nobody would dare come to steal your things. Nobody would dare send foreign mercenaries to interfere in your internal affairs. That's why, dear viewers, I appeal to the Arabs to think as Arabs, not as Christians or Muslims or Sunni or Shia, but as Arabs first and foremost. And if you do, you will have a respect in the world that you deserve, rather than the miserable situation we've been discussing tonight. It's been marvelous. Thank you all for participating. Thank you.